Some medieval elders wielded terrifying power while others begged for scraps. Same society, same era, completely opposite endings. What determines who lived with honor versus who died forgotten reveals something disturbing about human nature. Medieval people didn't count birthdays like we do today. They counted scars, wrinkles, and how many teeth they had left. Getting old wasn't about hitting some magic number, but about when your body started betraying you in obvious ways. Forget everything you know about retirement age. Medieval folks considered you old when you couldn't do your job anymore, not when some calendar said so. A blacksmith became old when his arms couldn't swing the hammer. A farmer became old when he couldn't plow a straight line. Most people never expected to see what we call old age. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, but that number tricks you. Lots of babies died, which dragged the average down. If you survived childhood diseases and made it to 20, you had decent odds of reaching 50 or 60. Medieval records rarely mentioned specific ages because most people didn't know exactly when they were born. Instead, they described old age through physical signs that everyone could recognize. Gray hair, bent back, shaky hands, missing teeth. These became the real markers of elderhood. Many families didn't plan for elderly relatives because they didn't expect them to live that long. Old age was like winning a medieval lottery, except half the time, nobody wanted the prize. When grandparents outlived expectations, families scrambled to figure out what to do with them. Medieval language had fascinating ways to describe old folks. Records mention people being worn out by years, bent with age, or feeble in body but sound in mind. These descriptions tell us more about medieval attitudes toward aging than any birth certificate could. Physical signs determined your social status more than actual years lived. A 50-year-old who could still work hard got treated like a middle-aged adult. A 40-year-old with chronic pain became elderly in everyone's eyes. Medieval society cared about function, not age, basically the world's first performance-based employment system. Different social classes aged at different rates. Wealthy people with good food and less manual labor stayed young longer. Poor folks doing backbreaking work looked old by their 30s. Rich people bought extra years with better living conditions. The original anti-aging treatment was just having money. Once medieval society labeled you as old, your treatment depended entirely on where you lived and who claimed responsibility for your care. Medieval households operated like small businesses where elderly relatives became either valuable assets or expensive liabilities. Caring for aging parents wasn't about love, it was about calculating whether keeping them alive made economic sense. Extended households typically included 3 generations crammed into spaces that would make modern families claustrophobic. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes even great-grandchildren shared the same roof, the same fire, and often the same tensions about who contributed what to family survival. Responsibility for elderly care followed strict gender rules. Sons inherited property and authority, but daughters and daughters-in-law provided daily caregiving. Men got the power, women got the dirty work. A medieval tradition that's unfortunately familiar. Treatment quality depended heavily on perceived usefulness rather than family affection. Elderly relatives who could still contribute labor, knowledge, or connections received better care than those who become completely dependent. Families made cold calculations about feeding someone who couldn't give anything back. Elderly widows and widowers faced completely different situations. Widowed men often remarried quickly to secure caregiving, while widowed women usually moved in with adult children or managed alone. Medieval dating wasn't about romance, it was about finding someone to change your bedpan. Family care had clear limits that revealed medieval priorities with brutal honesty. When resources became scarce, elderly members got smaller food portions. During housing shortages, they received the coldest, dampest spaces. Family loyalty lasted exactly as long as family prosperity, which wasn't very long in medieval times. Families sometimes lost elderly relatives during travels or simply stopped providing care when burdens became too heavy. These abandonments weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they happened through gradual neglect that slowly killed without obvious blame. The most telling aspect of medieval family elder care was its conditional nature. Good behavior earned good treatment. Usefulness earned respect. Gratitude earned continued support. Medieval families ran elder care like performance reviews where bad ratings meant reduced benefits. Even in loving families, Elderly members eventually became more of a burden than blessing, which raised difficult questions about what they could still contribute. Medieval elderly people didn't get gold watches and retirement parties. They got reassigned to whatever tasks their failing bodies could still handle. Old age meant career change, not career end, at least until your body gave up completely. Physical tasks shifted toward lighter but essential work. Tending small animals like chickens or rabbits, watching children during busy seasons, weaving cloth during winter months, sharpening tools that others would use. These jobs kept aging hands busy and families grateful. Indoor duties became the specialty of those whose outdoor working days had ended. Sorting grain to remove stones and bad seeds, spinning wool into thread, preparing vegetables for cooking, maintaining fires, work that required experience and patience rather than strength. Medieval society showed unexpected wisdom here. Elderly people became living libraries of practical knowledge that families desperately needed. They knew which weather signs predicted storms, which plants cured common ailments, which farming techniques worked best in difficult years. They were like medieval Google, except you had to feed them and listen to their complaints. Monasteries and convents found creative ways to keep elderly religious folks productive. Aging monks copied manuscripts with shaky but careful hands. Elderly nuns tended herb gardens that supplied monastery medicine. These institutions understood that purpose extended life better than comfort alone. The education role that elderly people filled within their communities was crucial. Teaching children basic skills, sharing family history, passing down religious knowledge. These weren't formal schools, but informal learning systems that kept culture alive through generations. Complete dependency marked the beginning of the end for medieval elderly people. When you couldn't contribute anything, no work, no knowledge, no entertainment value, family patience wore thin quickly. Medieval families practiced a brutal form of social Darwinism where usefulness determined survival. The transition from useful to useless happened gradually, then suddenly. One day you were teaching grandchildren to weave. The next day you couldn't remember their names or control basic bodily functions. It was like going from teacher to burden overnight, medieval retirement planning at its finest. The question remained, how did the broader community view these aging members, and what roles did society create for them? Medieval communities treated their elderly like living archives, valuable when you needed information, ignored when you didn't. Respect for elders wasn't automatic. It was earned through demonstrated wisdom and maintained through continued usefulness. Wise elders found themselves consulted on everything from crop rotation to marriage disputes, but only if their advice had proven reliable over time. Communities remembered which old folks gave good counsel and which ones just liked hearing themselves talk. Medieval people had no patience for wisdom that didn't actually work. Village decisions sometimes included elderly input, especially from those who'd witnessed similar problems before. A farming dispute might be settled by the oldest resident who remembered how previous generations handled similar conflicts. These weren't formal leadership roles, but informal advisory positions based on experience. Religious communities offered different opportunities for elderly involvement. Old folks helped with church maintenance, assisted during religious ceremonies, and provided spiritual guidance to younger members. They became part-time clergy without the official title or decent pay. Community attitudes toward elderly people varied dramatically based on local customs and current circumstances. Some villages revered their elders as connections to ancestral wisdom. Others viewed them as burdens draining resources that younger members needed for survival. Public begging revealed the harsh reality of community attitudes toward elderly poor. Some communities showed extra charity toward elderly beggars, reasoning that old age deserved sympathy. Others treated elderly beggars worse than younger ones, assuming they'd failed to plan properly for their later years. Some elderly women gained unusual influence through roles as midwives, healers, or wise women. Their knowledge of herbal medicine and childbirth made them indispensable to communities that had no other medical resources available. They were medieval doctors without medical degrees or malpractice insurance. Community respect came with expectations about behavior and attitude. Grateful, humble elderly people received better treatment than demanding, complaining ones. Communities wanted their elders to be wise and dignified, not bitter and troublesome. The difference between community respect and community tolerance often came down to economic factors that determined how much elderly care people could afford. Medieval old age came in two completely different versions: luxury edition for the wealthy and survival mode for everyone else. Rich people bought comfortable deaths, while poor people just hoped for quick ones. Wealthy elders lived like medieval kings in their final years. Servants handled every physical need. Warm beds kept them comfortable during cold nights. Vast land holdings provided ongoing income, and family members competed for inheritance by providing excellent care. Money bought dignity, comfort, and extended life. Poor elders faced brutal realities that make modern poverty look gentle: cold, hunger, early abandonment when families couldn't afford extra mouths, forced begging in streets where former neighbors pretended not to recognize them. Medieval poverty was like a slow-motion death sentence that started the moment you stopped earning money. Noble families treated elderly relatives as honored ancestors whose comfort reflected family prestige. These elders maintained their own households with full staff, received the best medical care available, and continued influencing family decisions until death. Peasant elders discovered that family loyalty had strict financial limits. When crops failed or taxes increased, elderly relatives became expendable expenses. Families made heartbreaking calculations about feeding someone who couldn't contribute to survival efforts. The medical care difference determined who lived longer and who suffered more. Wealthy elders accessed physicians, imported medicines, and comfortable sick rooms. Poor elders relied on folk remedies, family knowledge, and hoped that illness would pass quickly. Early pension systems sometimes helped bridge the gap between rich and poor elder care. Successful guilds provided retirement support for master craftsmen. Wealthy patrons occasionally supported former servants. Churches offered basic care for elderly people who'd served faithfully. These weren't government programs, but private charity that worked when people felt generous. The vast majority of medieval elders fell into the poor category, which meant their old age depended on family generosity, community support, and plain luck. Most got none of these reliably. Being poor and old in medieval times was like playing the worst board game ever, one where all the rules were stacked against you, and losing meant actual death. The difference between wealthy and poor elderly treatment became most obvious during community crises when survival priorities eliminated any pretense about equal treatment. Medieval crises turned elderly people into the first casualties of survival mathematics. When food ran out, old folks got smaller portions. When families fled danger, grandparents got left behind. When plague struck, elderly people died first and got buried last. Famine revealed the brutal calculus of medieval family loyalty. Many elderly relatives voluntarily reduced their food intake to help younger family members survive, but others found their rations cut without consultation. Families made decisions based on who had the best chance of living through starvation periods. War created impossible choices about elderly care that haunted families for generations. Young adults faced decisions between taking aging relatives on dangerous journeys or abandoning them to approaching armies. Most chose abandonment, though they called it guarding the homestead, to make themselves feel better. Some elders embraced their sacrificial roles willingly rather than becoming burdens during family evacuations. They'd lived full lives and felt comfortable risking whatever years remained to protect family property or help others escape. These elderly guardians often saved family fortunes by staying behind while everyone else panicked. Stories from sieges and famines include shocking examples of elderly abandonment that reveal medieval priorities with painful clarity. Families lost their aging relatives during evacuations. Communities stopped feeding elderly beggars when resources became scarce. Old age became a death sentence disguised as unfortunate circumstances. Some elderly people found ways to contribute during crises that earned them continued care and respect. Old women who knew herbal medicine treated plague victims. Elderly men who understood military tactics advised defensive preparations. Usefulness bought survival even during desperate times. Plague years brought out both the best and worst in elderly treatment. Some old folks isolated themselves to protect family members from infection. Others stepped forward to care for plague victims, reasoning that they had less to lose than people with children to raise. Crisis became a final exam where failure meant abandonment, and the test questions were written by starvation, disease, and war. Even during the worst times, some elderly people managed to break all the rules and thrive despite impossible circumstances. Medieval society had rigid rules about old age, but some elderly people shattered every expectation and rewrote the script for what aging could look like. These exceptional elders didn't just survive, they dominated, commanded, and sometimes terrified people half their age. Military leadership sometimes remained in elderly hands long after physical strength had faded. Old kings led armies from horseback when they could barely walk. Aging generals planned battles with minds sharp enough to compensate for bodies that had betrayed them. They proved that experience could beat youth when wisdom guided warfare. Elderly women running farms or businesses after widowhood created another category of exceptional aging. These widows took control of operations their husbands had managed, often improving efficiency and profits through different approaches. They became respected business people when society expected them to become dependent relatives. The most fascinating exceptions were wise women, or healers who gained power and fear as they aged. Their knowledge of herbal medicine, childbirth, and mysterious remedies made them indispensable to communities that had no other medical resources. Some became so influential that people whispered about supernatural powers. Medieval myths about longevity connected extreme old age with divine favor or magical knowledge. People who lived exceptionally long lives were sometimes viewed as blessed, cursed, or possessing secret wisdom that explained their survival. These beliefs could protect elderly people from abandonment or abuse. Some elderly religious leaders maintained authority that would make modern executives jealous. Aging abbots controlled vast monastery resources. Elderly bishops influenced political decisions. Old priests shaped community beliefs through decades of trusted service. Religious office provided job security that lasted until death, the ultimate tenure system. These exceptional cases often changed how entire communities viewed aging and elderly people. When respected elders maintained dignity, authority, and usefulness despite physical decline, it raised expectations for how other elderly people might be treated. Individual circumstances, personal history, and sheer determination could overcome social expectations about what elderly people could or should do. These extraordinary elders proved that aging didn't have to mean powerlessness, abandonment, or irrelevance, but they were exceptions that highlighted how difficult normal medieval old age really was. Medieval elderly treatment wasn't about kindness or cruelty, it was about survival, usefulness, and economic reality. Some elders thrived, others barely survived, but all faced the same truth. Growing old meant playing by rules that could change without warning.